On behalf of the staff of the SubRegatta 93, I want to welcome you all on board. Thanks for coming and participating and asking questions. We're all here to advance the art of model submarine building in its two basic forms: static, that is display models, and radio control. I'm David Merriman. This is the first of a four-part lecture series. The intent is to disseminate as much information on the art, or if you will, craft, of model submarine building. I'm a professional. That means I make money at this. I produce kits. I also work for the defense industry, sometimes the motion picture industry, and provide models that these clients require. The slides which will accompany my talk do better than any amount of talking to illustrate what this is about. The first slide we have up here shows some work which was performed about a couple of years ago rather, and demonstrates fiberglass construction techniques. The larger model in the background is the world-famous Akula. That's 1/96 scale. That was what we see it here is while I was in primer gray, while I was still working it up and fine-tuning the systems. The gray model underneath the Akula is the Collins class submarine, a Swedish design, engineered and being built now in Australia to replace their rather long in the tooth Oberons. I was commissioned to build several Collins class models for a defense client. Beneath that is another Collins model at an early point in construction with the bare fiberglass parts. Fiberglass construction is used principally by your RC people, either by the manufacturers who produce the kits or by the more adventurous scratch builder. The medium is good for us in that it renders lightweight, very robust, and thin-walled structures. If you have a big block of wood which you whittle out to make room for things, you lose a lot of available volume to the wall thickness of the wood. Wood is not ideal because it's basically a sponge and has to be sealed. Yet wood, with temperature and humidity changes, tends to expand and contract and cracks. Wood is not a good medium for radio control. If it's well seasoned, it's quite suitable for static models. Yeah. What we see here are some models produced by other people, specifically David Copeland of Copeland Models. The large gray one is quite obviously a Typhoon. As you can see, the configuration at the stern is the classic NATO interpretation of what we thought the tail feathers looked like. Well, since some good hard information has come out, we found that it does not have a beaver tail stern plane. It has a more traditional stern plane arrangement and ducted, or if you will, shrouded propellers. It's not a pump jet, they are simply shrouds. David produces a kit at a very reasonable price. These models, incidentally, are all to the scale of 1/96. The black finish one is the American Ohio. Again, these are all GRP, glass reinforced plastic, otherwise known as fiberglass. And the lower one, still in primer gray, is his Los Angeles class. I have all of these, and I'm working on them. And I can tell you that Dave Copeland produces an excellent fiberglass product at a very competitive price. And I say that freely. He's a direct competitor in that I produce RC kits at 1/96 scale. So he's good, and he's got me on the run. Some of the motion picture work I do, the most recent thing is for CBN University. I'm the effects supervisor for sequences simulating the Tenerife air disaster in the Canary Islands back in '77. The work before that was Red October, other than TV work, but this is a shot taken by Greg Jean, the supervisor of miniatures for Boss Films when we were working on Red October. I was tasked to design the American submarine Dallas and the Soviet submarine, the Alpha class Konovalov, which we see here. After designing these, the art department produced the working drawings, and the model builders at Boss Films produced the miniatures. An interesting point in Red October, all the filming was done dry for wet. That is to say, the models were filmed in a studio in a dry environment, and the illusion of water, particulate matter, bubbles, and whatnot was plugged in later optically in an optical printer from frames which were composed in a computer. So even in Red October, we see a lot of computer-generated and enhanced shots. The Konovalov here, the only thing I made physically in the model was the propeller. I was contracted to build all the propellers for the models because apparently the union guys weren't quite up to it, quite frankly. And I get a lot of work because I'm a non-union guy, and I can produce on time. So I'm good. Next slide. No, I'm very good. This is the Dallas model being worked up at Boss Films in LA, or I think it's Marina Del Rey. I designed this, and I also built all of the appendages, the sail, fairwaters, stern planes, rudders, cleats, propeller. Now, I have to apologize on behalf of the production crew. Those vertical stabilizers appearing on the 688 submarine wasn't my idea. I got a phone call after I made a very heated conversation to the studio. I got some photos like this and shot them an inquiry saying, why are there vertical stabilizers on an LA boat? There aren't any. And very clearly I defined that in my drawings. And my answer from the art director himself was, well, gee, Dave, we bought a DML kit and that had it. Do you mean you know more about this than DML? With that mindset, I just, well, okay, fine. Have a nice day. So here we see the larger, well, in fact, they only built one model of the Dallas, but you can see that an access point has been cut into the side of the model to accept a pipe stand, which is the mounting fixture. Later, such fixtures during the shoot are eliminated in a blue screen process. And for the very large, I think it was 35-foot long Red October model, that was actually suspended on wire, kind of a throwback to the old Lydecker. Kind of interesting, we all poo-pooed this piece of information when it appeared about 8 years ago. It's Gorbachev receiving a model from a crew member aboard a Typhoon-class submarine. Now, intelligence people obviously studied this carefully, and one can indeed discern a traditional stern with shrouded propellers. In other words, this model's configuration was validated by the recently released public domain shots of the stern of a dry dock Typhoon. We had this information 8 years ago. We all dropped the ball on this. This appeared in the public domain. This shot is taken out of a page of Naval Proceedings, a non-classified publication. The dope was in front of us all this time. As I said, I did all the propellers on Red October. I even did the torpedo propellers. I was given carte blanche for design, so I went to the Rockwell Mark 46 Mod II torpedo, pulled out an illustration out of an advertisement, and had all the dope on the propeller I needed, so I made this counter-rotating unit. Incidentally, the American torpedoes and the Soviet torpedoes were the same thing, just repainted. And if you recall the shots, they almost appeared in silhouette anyway, so you can hardly discern anything. The airdrop sequences were dummies, obviously borrowed by the Navy. When you see one dropped out of the bay of a bomber, of a Bear bomber, that was a model shot as well. The DSRV, which mysteriously appears midway in the movie, was built there by Boss. I built the propeller and provided all the documentation, which I had from the contractor. So that's the DSRV mounted above the Los Angeles miniature. This is at Boss Film. I got a reputation in Hollywood now as warp engines are us. And what happens is when you're working, particularly for the motion picture TV industry, they typecast you. Not only the guys in front of, but also the guys behind the camera tend to wind up doing specific things. Well, as far as submarine movies, I do propellers. As far as science fiction movies, I do warp engines. So I'm warp engines are us. So having worked on Star Trek motion pictures and the TV series, that seems to be the only assignments I get. But those assignments are better than no assignments. To demonstrate more about the propellers and propulsors that are unique to model submarines, I give you this example, which is a pretty good idea of what the pump jet on the Seawolf SSN-21 class will look like. I borrowed very heavily from the Mark 48 torpedo, which is on public display at several institutions. Keyport here at the Submarine Force Library Museum. It's in the public domain in the form of photographs in various journals. So, armed with the information on the propulsor on the Mark 48 torpedo, one quickly identifies the unique characteristics that defines a pump jet. A device, a duct tube with a stator or flow straightener and a rotor. The rotor imparts a velocity on the fluid, water. The swirling mass, which is normally discharged from a traditional propeller, is straightened, recovering some of the rotational velocity and translating it into thrust. That is the characteristic of a pump jet over a quart nozzle or a simple ducted propeller, in that you have a device to recover some of the swirl energy that's the downstream side of the rotor or propeller, if you will. So, armed with that information and knowing what a 48 looked like, and then getting a rough idea of what the Brits are doing with Trafalgar and their SSBN pump jets, I developed this design for what I think the 21 looks like. It's hard to get confirmation from the Navy or any authority in DOD because their stock answer is, I will not confirm or deny that configuration. But after they say that and then they do this, then you got a pretty good idea you're on track. So what we have here is a 1/192nd scale model, static, of a Seawolf submarine with a pump jet. That particular pump jet, now we get into model building techniques here, is kind of a hybrid of different construction materials. Now this demonstrates vacuum forming employed to make this shroud, which is the, if you will, a containment of a pump jet. The rotor, which is the gray item to the extreme left, and the stator, which is a fixed item, which also supports the shroud, were made out of plastic and wood. This master, in turn, was used to make room temperature vulcanizing rubber molds, which were used to make production pieces because I needed numerous items. The wooden puck or plug up there was used to vacuum form the duct. So armed with these scratch-built items, I went into production of the tooling to realize numerous copies of the Seawolf propulsor. Here we have the finished Seawolf model. The model itself is cast out of polyurethane resin from rubber molds. The pump jet, stern planes, sail were discrete pieces, as were the mass. Model's about 21 inches long. I employ different ways of getting the liquid resin to completely fill the cavity of the rubber mold. One technique is to spin or rotate the mold after you've poured in the material around a fixed axis. In this case, a variable speed drill is spinning the rotor stator mold at about 800 RPM. This forces all the bubbles towards the axis of rotation, in that a bubble rises by virtue of differential pressure. Well, if you increase the pressure on the outer portions of the mold by rotating, it's a centrifugal force, you drive the bubbles towards the center of rotation, the axis, and up through the sprue hole, which is at the top at the center of rotation. So that's one way of eliminating bubbles. An easier way is to simply pressurize the mold filled with the liquid material to about 30 psi and until the resin cures. This, like a diver who undergoes recompression, who is suffering from the bends, you're crushing the bubbles back into solution. In this case, polyurethane, bubbles being entrapped gas, air. So by pressurizing it, we reduce those bubbles back into solution where they remain until it solidifies. So that's the preferred way of rendering bubble-free castings. The technique I employ to make tools, mass, and actual model parts is to acid etch brass or stainless steel. The subject's been covered at length recently in Fine Scale Modeler, an excellent article. I've also written about it in Scale Modeler and Scale Ship Modeler. And I demonstrated here in a recent project is 12-inch long models of Flight 3 Los Angeles class submarine. Here I've acid etched the stencils for the VLS hatches, the propeller. Incidentally, MB Models renders acid etched propellers very much like this. So I have to give them credit, because I saw one of the things, I said, that's a neat way of doing it. So MB Models gets credit for that propeller idea. which is incidentally sandwiched between two metal turned pieces to form the propeller and hub assembly, and after which it's all sweat soldered together into one unit. Acid etching requires that you first do your artwork several times to required size, and then to render negatives or positives on clear film, to sandwich and expose a coated piece of brass or stainless, to develop it, and then to immerse it into either an alkali or an acid solution to attack the plate. The items you wish to keep are protected by the photoresist, which is coated on the brass plate. The assembly of that propeller, as I described, I turned the hub and the other piece, sandwiched the acid etch piece between it, went ahead and soldered it up. You see here I'm applying heat and just sweat soldering the blades in place, after which point they're bent around and sanded and primed, and becomes a master from which to make molds for low melt metal parts, which we'll demonstrate later here. So you can see the work was quite small, and in spite of the setup I didn't burn my hands here, so don't worry. Everything's held in a pin vise, so you get an idea of how small that propeller was. These were 12-inch long models of a Flight 3688. You can see the propeller, the dunce cap, and the base of the hub. Those incidentally were turned on a small watchmaker's lathe. Next. This isn't a submarine, but does demonstrate one form of construction. Some people only going to build one submarine, but it has to be GRP, glass reinforced plastic, fiberglass. Well, one method is to go ahead and take polystyrene foam, not polyurethane, but polystyrene foam, and build it up into the required structure. The sample here is a big rocket I was asked to build for the Smithsonian. Ellie is just standing there to give you an idea of the size. Now, once that was machined to shape, and I'll show you that, it was then laid, fiberglass was laid up over it, the gel coat was then laid over that, and we sanded it down and got a very good finish on it. And if we had wished, through the open end, we would pour in gasoline to eat away the foam, rendering a hollow structure. Now, of course, it's a one-shot deal, but if you're only going to build that one RC submarine hull, this is a preferred way. Of course, you have to undersize your dimensions by the projected thicknesses of resin and glass. So your tolerances are tight to keep, or are a little hard to keep. Okay, next shot. This shows the completed model on display at the Smithsonian. It's at the Air and Space now on the second deck. The major portions are all fiberglass. The wings were built in hard shell molds. You've seen how the major hull portion was made. The other items were laid up out of styrene and plexiglass. Next shot. This shows how I took down that big tapered cylinder. I simply mounted it on the work table, made 2 end places so I could rotate it, and laid up against a sanding machine as I rotated it. So I got my specific station diameters right down to perfect rounds, and just by incrementally moving and clamping down the sanding machine, I was able to achieve the taper without making a lathe. So that's just one little trick. On top of it, you see the form which I used to, which was lofted off the drawing to make sure I had the right contour. And that's all there was to that. So it might give you an idea if you want to turn that albacore. This is a nice way to do it. You want to do a 1/48 or 1/32 albacore? This is how I do it, out of foam. Next shot. A rather diminutive size submarine was the NR-1, Rickover's play toy. I secured piping tab drawings and constructed a model to a scale of 1/192, which is 1/16 inch equals to foot, and that rendered a model that's only 8 inches long. Now this is the master, which is made principally out of wood. The duplicated items on this were the stern planes. So I made one master and then cast up 2, and that rendered identical pieces for the sake of symmetry, and mounted them on the master. They in turn became an integral part of the master. Next shot. Again, employing the casting technique of rotating. Here you see my daughter Hilda shortly before a tragic accident, but no, nothing happened. But you see she's at eye level there. When you pour the resin in, it splatters all over the place, if you don't have a shield. But that would have took a grin right off of her face, but we put the shield up and spun the thing, and that rendered a bubble-free structure. The resin I use, with a room temperature of about 75 to 80 degrees, kicks over, and I can demold in about 10 minutes. So it's a quick production resin, but not as quick as that Alumilite you can buy. That stuff, you mix it up and you pour it and it goes, eek! You know, oh my gosh, you know. You can, yeah, you can only use Alumilite on a cold day, and you got to be quick. Okay, next one. And that's the finished model. It took first place at a IPMS regional. The antenna was the length of Ellie's hair. It worked pretty good. Right scale, right color. But that's principally all resin. I had to build 10 models of the Romeo. Now here's a subject with an interesting history. Designed by the Soviets, Designed by the Soviets, built by the Chinese, maintained by the Americans, owned and operated now by the Egyptians. Strange bedfellows. But these are the Romeos. This is the latest version, operated by Egypt. I was commissioned by Libroscope to build these models as gimmies for the commanding officers on these boats. So as far as I know, I'm the first guy other than the contractors to get complete documentation on the external configuration of the Chinese Romeo. And it's a resin model almost exclusively. To demonstrate how I get the detail into the master and hence into the mold, and then from there into the cast parts, demonstrating the use of acid-etched inserts. In this case, these are main seawater suctions and discharges near the stern. I acid-etch those because that's a process where I can get high relief, very tight definition, and by inlaying that into the wooden master, I achieve a highly detailed master. You couldn't do this in wood. I don't care if it's Jutland or anything. But acid etching was the technique of choice for that type of relief, whereas wood was the material of choice for broad carving. One tends to learn these things in time. Next shot. This is one of our build-up 688 kits, 1/192nd scale, Los Angeles, and just demonstrates what can be done with resin and metal. The propellers, zincs, mass, cleats are all cast from low melt metal. It's a what's called white metal, not Britannia. It's white metal. It's principally tin with a little bit of antimony. I do my own casting at home. Next shot. The acid etching, as I alluded to earlier, can be used to render stencils for scribing as well as painting. Here we have 2 acid etched stencils used to scribe out the masters for our Los Angeles kit. Here you can see the plastic piece which has already been scribed and the tool used to do the job. You can get the tightest little detail from acid etched stencils. This diver demonstrates the metal casting technique. I've built a lot of these when I was in the Navy. A lot of my buddies at various duty stations wanted, I got to have Jake, so I'd make them. And it got to be a chore, so I was compelled to find the best techniques for rendering the detail items, and I eventually embraced metal casting. The weights, incidentally, that's a natural lead finish because they're lead. The control valve, spit cock, air control, exhaust valve, the screens on the ports, everything was cast out of metal. Next shot. Here we see the metal pieces for Jake just pulled out of the mold. And what we have here is a rotational disc mold used to force molten metal into the various cavities. Each cavity defines the particular item. Here you can see the weights, air control valve, shiv for the knife, handle for the knife. You have to make sure that you don't sling your metal when you're spinning it. I got belly band scars to prove it, and so does Ellie. So again, you use a shield before you start spinning things up. That was a hard-learned lesson. Here we have rubber molds. Now the question is, well, don't you burn them up? Some RTV, room temperature vulcanizing silicon rubbers, will burn at a relatively low temperature. However, BJB out of California produces an ideal material with a constant working temperature of at least 600 degrees. My molten material is workable at 520, so I'm in the green as far as working temperatures for this material. What we see here is two strong backs which clamp together around these discs, hold them in place on the motor, which is a constant speed 650 RPM motor, which I yanked out of a washing machine. And the long bolts used to sandwich the strong backs. In operation, this stage shot shows the motor, constant speed motor, the strong backs. In between, we have the rubber mold. The center of rotation is an open sprue hole. We have the molten metal, which is poured in during the spin. It takes about 5 seconds for the stuff to solidify in the cavities. I can almost immediately shut down the motor, wait about 30 seconds, and demold the entire assembly and snip off the pieces from the sprue. Very simple operation. You don't see a splash shield here, so this is a stage shot here. Everything was cool. I just spun it by hand and did a rather slow shutter to give the illusion of motion here. But that's how metal casting is typically done, in a rotating disc mold. Next shot. How many, by a show of hands, how many have encountered problems getting paint to stick to metal? Okay, the trouble is metal oxidizes and also picks up your oils, which are natural barriers to the adhesive, not cohesive, adhesive qualities of paint. The way to achieve a good bonding of your primers and colors is to give mechanical tooth microscopic pitting of the surface of the substrate, in this case a lead or a tin-based metal. You do that by soaking briefly in ferric chloride acid. About a couple of seconds, it oxidizes, which is evidenced by the black color. You can see the two pieces down there which have turned dark color. You take them and you wash them off with soapy water to neutralize any clinging acid. You have now rendered a toothed surface which will accept your paints, and your bonding will be enhanced greatly. So that's a little trick for you. Of course, those items which have to maintain a metal appearance, like scope shears and things like that, not scope shears, but scope shafts or telescoping rods, are left in the natural state and buffed out with triple-odd steel wool. Recent model built, I typically don't build from kits, but I did use the hull from the Revell Lionfish. This thing has been released in different names over the last 20 years, but now it's Lionfish. He needed a model of the Rasher, which was a Migraine 3 boat. These boats were modified in Philly in '53 with, I think, a 24-foot extension at the forward battery control room bulkhead. I had to build a model that reflected that change, so like the yard. Well, not so much like the yard. I took two kits, took the required section from one and grafted in and lengthened the model at that station. Further modifications to render the Rasher, which was a Migraine 3 boat with a big surface search and air search radar. Everything was scratch built with the exception of the hull. And we see here acid etched pieces, cast resin pieces, vacuum form pieces, and wood, not to mention a kit hull. So, next slide. Demonstrating the work that was involved, of course, the Revell kit has this feature, which you really only see in the salmon class boats. These depressed areas over the bow and stern was only seen in salmon. Yet they're advertised as Gato Baleo. They could even be Tinch class boats. So to get it up to Rasher standard, I had to fill that in with automotive body putty, rescribe the shutter doors, and of course punch out all the limber holes for bow buoyancy and the superstructure. So a lot of work was involved. Also, you can see the stretch. When they stretched this hull, they made no attempt to continue the nice flowing lines at the hull at the bow. They just put in a big cylindrical section there. So I had to capture that. Here we have all the scratch-built parts, well, not all of them, but most of them that made up the Rasher conversion. We have a wooden sail, and we have the other items which have been laid out. You can pretty well figure out what they are. So just about every technique in my inventory was employed on this one model. The acid etching on this was employed for the hatch hand wheels on the axis hatches, which appeared in the conning tower, in the forward and after axis trunks. And I even made some acid etch guys, which I used on another model. And as you notice, I have the 269 stencil, which was taped on the model and used to get those hull numbers. Of course, the centers of the 6 and 9 had to be made up from masking tape. And here we see cast metal pieces, principally cleats, anchor, propellers, SJ radar, hatches, and some other nonsense, all going together. You can see atop the wooden sail is a vacuum-formed piece which accepts the mass. Also, that fairing over the sonar head, just ahead on the deck, was vacuum-formed. The top of the hull was a completely scribed piece of plastic. It wasn't a piece of evergreen. It was individually scribed out to get the scale effect. A shot of the finished model with all the paraphernalia on the deck. Basically, my Green 3s were fleet boats. They were not guppied. There were not any improvements in propulsion or streamlining other than the sail. So what you have here is a World War II era submarine that's been stretched, has received the rather primitive radars of the time in a role which was an interim need of the fleet for air search ahead of the fleet in support of their operations. With the advent of Hawkeye-type aircraft that could carry these radars, these submarines were either stricken from the roles or transferred to a new category. So Rasher was later converted back to a fleet standard, yet retained the sail but no antenna. This is my model of the Akula operating in a fringe pool. It's rather maneuverable, except it has a very wide turning radius because of the rather small surface area on the rudders. It uses a CO2 ballast system, which works great. I love it, and I think is suitable for larger models. We got guys like John White to thank for developing CO2 systems for our use. And it kind of exemplifies what the subcommittee is all about, is a bunch of guys with various areas of expertise sharing it, and as a result we all can apply these things to whatever we're working on. The glass reinforced molds for the Akula were formed around wooden masters. The fiberglass parts were laid up in the mold, and once they were yanked out, they were assembled, and work went like pretty much a kit. You glue it together, you fair things up, and you just move forward with it. You just keep on building. Next shot. That's the stern. I reinforced the appendages in that I had a lot of thin-walled items that were really subject to breakage. I coated everything with resin and laid up fiberglass to reinforce. Here I am fairing in some of that work. The bullet on top there, what we believe is a towed passive fish, probably a half to 3/4 mile long piece of wire for passive transducer, is housed in that fairing. That was vacuum formed and attached to a cast resin fixed vertical stabilizer, which was reinforced with carbon fiber for strength. The carbon was laid into the mold before it was buttoned up, and then the resin was poured, impregnating the reinforcing carbon. Renders a very stout structure. Incidentally, I'm producing resin pieces for the De Boer's 48th hull, as well as propellers and parts for some of the Copeland models. So resin are us, I guess. So, and of course we're doing that in support of our own kits. Next slide, please. Here's the Akula in the earlier paint scheme. I repainted this thing a couple of months ago, get rid of that dark gray, which is almost invisible in water, and went to black. The Akula as it is now is, well, a lot easier to see, and a little bit more photogenic, I think. Next shot. This is a shot from the recent paint job. Here I am masking out the white markings which adorn the top of the deck. I strive to put all these details on for one reason. It really enhances visibility, because when you're out there driving, if you can't see it, you can't drive it. So everything that's white and stands in contrast is put on there. Somebody might question, well, Dave, how come you put your hull numbers on the sail on the skipjack? They didn't go on patrol like that. I got to see it, pal. Come on. So it may not be perfectly scale-like, but we put them on there. Next one, please. That's my daughter hanging out at the bottom of the pool. We let her up in about an hour, and she had a weight belt on. We had to help her up. That's the Akula just sitting on the bottom waiting for somebody to drive away. It's a fun model now. Even though it takes a lot to prep, I've learned a lot since and have applied it to the other models. It's a fun to operate sort of submarine. Relatively low maintenance now. It's not like model airplanes where you go out there, just make sure your batteries are banged up, kick over the motor and throw it in the air. There's quite a bit more pre-operation and post-operation maintenance that has to be performed. And if you don't post-op these things, they're going to turn to mush. So one has to be very careful that he puts, like a horse, you don't put it away wet. You take care, make sure everything's dry, air things out, put it away correctly, lube things up, get ready for the next run. Static model of David Bushnell's Turtle, 1776. He operated this thing against the Brits with some strategic success in that Lord Howe and company were a little bit more careful on where they parked their ships near New York. As an engineering feat, it stands alone as a remarkable piece of work by one man, a very driven, rather weird guy, but a guy who had an idea and saw it through completion, and a rather successful item, though for the operator it presented a great physical challenge. Sergeant Ezra Lee did a pretty fair job of getting near and perhaps bumping up against the flagship. What was the name of it? The Eagle. And failed in the attack to affix his charge. But other than that, this put the Brits on notice that, yes, New York was being, as today, hosting a lot of terrorists, which is exactly what David Bushnell would have been regarded as a terrorist. One country's terrorist is another country's freedom fighter. So an interesting occurrence in New York. Little did they know that so many years later, New York's trade towers would be subjected to the same treatment by terrorists. Yet in Iran, they would be called freedom fighters. It's a matter of perspective, isn't it? Next slide. The wood boring screw on top of the Turtle was achieved by sweat soldering 3 lengths of wire around a bigger core, this forming the auger bit. It looks rather involved, but when you take a look at how it's done, it's relatively simple. And there you see the auger bit, simply by wrapping some small caliber wire around a larger centerpiece. I was rather impressed with myself. The resin work is done by injecting or pouring liquid resin, which has been catalyzed into a rubber mold. The rubber mold is made from these materials. Here you see a rubber mold, and in one half is the cast resin pieces. First, you produce the rubber mold by laying up the rubber over masters, which are made out of metal, wood, whatever suffices, whatever medium you're working in. Once they cure out, you then use the empty mold to form the resin. A larger model, these are these 12-inch models I made of the Sturgeon-class submarine using a rubber mold. These are the masters in the first mold half. Next shot. I produced about 60 or 70 spadefish models. One of these appeared in the opening sequences of the motion picture Hunt for Red October. Vacuum forming can be used not only for the parts on a model, but as, in this case, a scribing stencil here used to put in the shutter doors on a 640 class submarine. Here you see a vacuum formed scribing stencil being used to put on the engraved markings for the top of the sail in the same class of sub, and the tools used to cut it out. And here we have the scribed in shutter doors and the stencil. Working for industry, Rockwell is a prime contractor on the data management systems in the Combat Information Center aboard the Collins-class submarine. I was commissioned to build the control section in a rather large scale. And here we have the control room built up and ready to go to the client. Now, this vignette, if you will, tells a little story. It's the captain at the periscope rather excitingly gesturing towards the XO, who's at the navigation center, a dead reckoning plot, which incidentally has a map of Kiel Harbor. So what the devil are the Australians doing at Kiel Harbor at periscope depth? Well, that begs the question, which makes for an interesting diorama. So those who build dioramas try to make it an exciting, intriguing story. Now, not everybody's going to get it, but those who do are the people you want to impress. A lot of the detail on the consoles, the ballast control panel, the diving stand, and other workstations receive these acid etch parts, monitor screens. So those were banged out of acid etch material and affixed to the model itself. Here you can see that I also use lighting effect. All the CRTs have actual representations. This is all tactical information as well as engineering plant status. You have 7 integrated workstations. Each one can perform the operation of any number of monitored systems on board. So in control room you have at hand everything you need to know about on-ship services, sensors, the tactical plot could be punched up. On this class of submarine, they don't even have a manned engine room. Everybody ahead of the engineering bulkhead stays there when they're underway. These very low manning level, about 40 people on a boat that's about 250 foot long. And they stand weird watches too, but hey, it's not the way we do things, but that's the way they do. Here you can see the map of Kiel, the XO. Next shot. That is a Collins-class submarine. That's what the Australians are replacing their Oberons with. It's a rather interesting package, but everybody's rather skeptical. Being designed by the Swedes, who work in rather chilly, choppy water, now the Australians want this submarine, which is going to be working in temperate waters. Some skeptics are wondering if it's going to be successful. Well, we won't know until these things are, underway. But the first boat should be launched shortly. And then I think they have 5 other boats following down the ways, all being built in Australia, but designed by the Swedes. Next shot. The Collins-class submarines, like most of my work, is glass laid up. Here we have the hard shell molds. Here I'm spraying in gel coat, which is the first operation. After the gel coat hardens, I put in the fiberglass, saturate it, repeat the process for 3 layers, and then I pop them out of the molds and assemble. Next shot. Here we see the hard shell mold and the glass laid up pieces of one Collins-class submarine. I'm RCing one of those right now, and it's a nice little package. The boat's about that big. Next shot. I was hired by the SubCommittee company out of Japan to build a show model of the old Aurora flying sub. SubCommittee hired Monogram, who owns the tooling now, when back in '73, I believe it was, when Aurora sold out. Monogram picked up on their tools, most of the tools, and continued the line. SubCommittee had Monogram build a couple of thousand kits, ship the parts to Japan, which involved a tariff. SubCommittee packaged under their label and then sent them back to the States, tariffed again, at which they were all sold for the very tidy sum of $36 a piece. Within a month, they were all sold. What's wrong with Monogram? They could have done it in-house, had them on the street for $12. What's wrong with Monogram? Anyway, I was hired to build this thing for the trade show circuit, and I was instructed to make the best looking model possible. I shot back, well, do you want it to be built out of the box because it's got to represent your product? No, make it look right. So, okay, so this model represents, if you will, a made-right Aurora kit. I also jazzed it up with the Cabbage Patch looking thing, which is a thing jumping out of water, and made discrete vacuform and resin pieces, and did a research on the actual miniatures to find out what it really looked like. And I have to say, Aurora did it right. They dropped the ball in a few areas, but for the most part, this is a very accurate model of the flying sub built for voyage to the bottom of the sea. Next slide. One of the modifications was to replace the access hatches on top and bottom with proper submarine type deck hatches. A return spring was a piece of fused wire bent over a drill shank and installed. The circular line around the angular inlet was rescribed. Very little contouring went on with the hull. Like I said, it was in pretty good shape. This is one of 6 fiberglass flying subs built at 20th Century Fox in support of the TV show Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea. 2 of which are still owned by Greg Jean. He's the guy who I work for most of the time on Next Generation in the movies. So Greg and I are, we're fanatics with this stuff privately, and we do this stuff professionally, so it's a pretty good relationship. This particular model was the one. How many saw the flying sub with landing gear? Right. How many saw it with crab claws? Next slide. It could do this, and now we know why we didn't see it, because it looks like a kid's toy. It's ugly. But they had one of the models rigged with crab claws, remotes, like the NR1 would use. We have this atrocious looking landing gear, but it could do these things. But wisely, I think, the editors decided not to use that footage. It's cable operated, so the actual physical operating mechanism is out of frame, but they would do a tight shot on the dynamic feature if they did it. Next shot. Kind of an enigma. I'm pretty big on propeller design and fabrication, so I'm demonstrating here how a typical Soviet Alpha class propeller would be put together. Try a little focus on that. People say, well, Dave, how did you determine what a Soviet Alpha class submarine propeller would look like? Well, I paid a naval architect $1,000. I gave him the specs on the Alpha. We know how fast it goes. We know those guys weren't too concerned about cavitation, because the mission of the Alpha was not to go out there and play ASW. It was to dash out and find that combat carrier group and sink as many ships as they could and then hightail it back to base. So we knew we had a high efficiency, perhaps a moderately cavitating propeller that had to dissipate 45,000 shaft horsepower, was pushing a specific shaped hull through the water at a certain speed. We know this guy goes at 45 knots at least. We know the hull form pretty well. We know how many horsepower were available at the shaft. With that criteria given to the naval architect, he designed a propeller by going to his charts. That's how I determined what the propeller was. I forked over $1,000 for it. So I don't know the math. I don't have the charts. I am not disciplined in this art. I hired somebody who was. Okay? So that's how we win. Someday we do get the good dope on the former Soviet submarines. I think this is going to be pretty close. So incidentally, this is the propeller I built for Greg Sharp for his Alpha kit. And construction starts by securing the drawings which show the geometry of the propeller, the projected shape of the blade, its pitch, helical twist, its foil section throughout the various radius points, the rake, and the geometry of the hub. These are a lot of specific criteria that have to be integrated. Here the master is formed by cast metal blades. Each blade, an identical brother to the other, are assembled on, in this case, a wooden hub in a special assembly jig. Once this master is assembled, it in turn is used as a master to produce the tooling for cast resin propellers, or using that same mold, producing cast wax propellers, which are used in a lost wax process to render brass propellers. Here we see another shot of the assembly jig. The angle guide is installed, which fixes each blade to the correct angle, and the cast metal blades. Here we have the propeller chart, which shows the specific angle at each specific radius along the disc and the geometry of the blade. This was prepared after I got the information from my naval architect. Work on our current RC kit, the skipjack. I made a fiberglass piece just to become a stencil for scribing into sonar dome atop and beneath the bow. You can see the cutout piece, which became the stencil, was laid on the model. I glued tabs of sandpaper on its inside face so it wouldn't slide around. Then I used a scratch awl describing the outline. If you take a look at the model on the table, you can see the result. Rather exotic tooling is used to achieve the what I call the motor cup. This contains the motor and gear train to a watertight cylinder. These are cast polyurethane items. This is a fiberglass strongback shell. The rubber mold is cast between the strongback and the wooden master. So this strongback holds this rather flimsy glove mold together during the casting operation. Next. Here we have an early shot of the skipjack and the watertight cylinder installed, showing the layout of control linkages in the shaft. The masters, the intermediate masters for our kit, as you can see, they too are fiberglass. I rendered it in a very thick gel coat so that I could scribe in the details. These in turn become the masters from which I produce production tools, molds. This is the hard shell mold for the sail. Now the sails we produce are going to be rendered in thin wall polyurethane with complete scribe ready to go. This is a test of the ballast tank installation I wanted to develop for our watertight cylinder. And though it won't go on a model, it did proof out some ideas I had about the geometry of the linkages coming from the servo. So this is a test article. It does everything a ballast tank does, but ultimately doesn't go into a model. It just proves the concept. And this is something that you yourselves will be doing either in static or RC. If you have a rather unique, bizarre construction technique or operation, you might want to first test it in a paper study, build something out of cardboard. This is especially done with linkages and cable runs. Manufacturers of real ships will have models built just to validate that the working drawings show the cable runs going correctly and you don't have interference or competition with other services like air conditioning, things like that. So as a model builder, sometimes it behooves you to build a test article to validate your idea. Because quite often what works in 2 dimensions on a piece of paper rendered with a pencil won't work on the 3 dimensions rendered with 3-dimensional objects. Okay, next. Masking out to put the numbers. Now the kit is going to have dry transfer, so you won't have to go through this, but it does demonstrate a quick process of rendering the Navy-style block characters using masking tape. Here I had to render the characters 585. And when you're masking something out, never use the raw edge of a piece of masking tape as it comes off the reel. You always put it down on a scrap piece of plastic with a straight edge, cut a line, and discard that edge. Now you got a nice sharp one. That's how you want to do your masking. Is always cut out your stuff on a piece of scrap, and you get nice sharp edges on the corner of your masking tape. If you don't, you get fuzzy lines. Next shot. Spraying in the numbers on the masked out sail. Low pressure, rather thick consistency of the paint. The paints I use are automotive acrylic lacquer. It's the same stuff your cars are painted with. So if you like the finish and if you like the durability of the paints you use on your cars, use those paints. I find a great deal of latitude as far as thinning. They also have flattening agents. The thinners are even formulated for humid or dry conditions. This isn't your typical homebrew can paint, which will flake off if you look at it wrong. This is durable stuff. It's as strong as the substrate, the material of the model itself. You're dealing with a fiberglass hull, take a lot of abuse. I also do minor restoration work occasionally. This is the 18-foot sea view from the motion picture TV production Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea. I did a rebuild on this thing. It was damaged in transit storage, and it was beat upon for many years. And when it was found by a collector, he purchased the thing at auction, sent it to me. I did the restoration, and ultimately we got it back to California. principally a fiberglass structure with a lot of wood, particularly in the area of the bilge keels, which suffered a lot of dry rot and had to be replaced. I'm in the effects industry, and you got a lot of pragmatic guys out there without any sense of history, and this is what happens when an Irwin Allen production team gets a hold of the model loft. This is one of the eight-footers, bastardized for, I believe, the pilot episode of Captain Nemo or something. Some god-awful, trashy thing, but they ripped up an artifact to get in a quick, cheap shot. And this is what effects restoration is all about, salvaging, even stealing these things before some moron gets a hold of it. Worst damage I've seen to a very important effects miniature was Jerry Lewis when he was doing Outer Space Nuts, or no, Way, Way Out, or Far, Far Out. He needed one 3-second gag shot of a bullet. So what does he do? He goes up in the Paramount Effects loft, gets a hold of the miniature from Conquest of Space, rips the fins off, paints it silver color, and that's his gag. When they're done, they toss it in the loft. And it's happening every day. People without a sense of history in the motion picture industry, because right now it's being run by a bunch of guys who are bankers and lawyers, and they have no sense of history. This stuff is at risk. It is daily being thrown out or bastardized like this. So, no, that was shit. It was thrown out shortly after it was used. Next shot. With the assistance of Mike Dory, I'm developing my own torpedoes, basically along the lines of what he's already designed. That is a propel-filled reservoir with a fill valve and a simple Teflon seat back aft, which forms the nozzle. Now these, of course, these is heavy brass, but these are used just to test fit the what will be cast foam pieces. Foam being used because it's very low density, and flotation being very critical. I'm attempting a 1/96 scale, which I'm told is impossible, but I love challenges, Mike. And of course, that's a 1/32 scale up there. So I'm currently working on practical torpedoes, though I haven't done it yet. And I think Mike will show us how it's done. Mr. Ridiculous, Tom Grafton. This guy is an engineering wacko. He has given me more insight into the availability of valves and systems than anybody, and constantly calling and visiting with the latest toy. And he's going to make one of these 22-inch models actually work as an RC model. And he's got some very exciting ideas, so stay tuned. This guy, he's sneaking up on everyone. Next shot. A typical installation in an RC submarine employing the devices that are available which help us protect a submarine. Between the receiver and ballast control servo here are two devices produced by Tom Yerge of High Tech Models. He has produced a water detector device on the lower left and a missing pulse detector. These boards do two things, and they're working together. They monitor the dry condition on board the boat and don't interfere as long as things are dry. And as long as there's a received signal from the transmitter, it leaves everything alone and you can operate the ballast system servo or solenoid, depending on what you're operating. In the event you lose the signal, it commands a blow. You get water in the watertight box, it commands a blow. One caveat, you don't lose electrical power and that you got gas on board. Will not work on a pump system.
Where do you get fiberglass from for your, you said the West system?
Yeah, get into your yellow pages, your local suppliers. Usually it's marine outlets. You want to work with 10-ounce cloth. I recommend for resin that you stay away from polyester resin. Use epoxy. It's about 5 or 8 times the expense, but it has a zero shrinkage or near zero shrinkage, so you're less likely or you're unlikely to warp your parts. The West system is preferred. It also comes with dispensing pumps. You'll spend about $70 to $80 for a 1-gallon kit, and that includes your hardener. And you spend another $8 for your metering pumps. And once you use that stuff, you never use anything else. Yeah, the other things, the tools, the mass, which you're going to need, you can probably get from the same source.
You don't have to go to thick at all?
No, you can keep it down to a 1/16 of an inch for the smaller ones and up to 3/16 of an inch for the bigger ones. I find some of the new kit manufacturers are going into overkill big time on wall thickness, okay? But as they become more production oriented, I think we're going to see the wall thickness get down to reasonable sizes. Anybody else? All right, Mike Dory's on deck. He's going to be covering torpedoes and some other things that you really should know about RC submarine. So I turn the floor over to Skip. Thank you very much.